Hi, everyone. Good morning from Alaska, from Anchorage, and good afternoon to many of you. I'm Julie Decker, and I'm the director and CEO of the Anchorage Museum. On behalf of the Henry Luce Foundation and our hosts at the New York Historical Society, I welcome you to this conversation, this series of conversations on American art and museums, a celebration of the Luce American Art Program's 40th anniversary. Since its founding in 1982, the American Art Program has provided support totaling $215 million to 500 museums across all 50 states. It continues to award approximately $7.5 million annually for innovative museum projects in the visual arts. Through this work, Luce seeks to advance the role of visual arts in an open and equitable society and the potential for museums to serve as public forums for art-centered conversations that celebrate creativity, explore difference, and seek common ground. With an eye towards the future and the best possible futures for art museums, these conversations will explore the capacity of art museums to challenge accepted histories and advance the dialogues in which we need to engage with diverse collaborators and communities. And I thank Luce and the New York Historical Society for having me and our guests, LaMont Hamilton and John Grade, with us today. Our topic for this conversation is about connections between art and land. Jedediah Purdy, in his book, After Nature, A Politics for the Anthropocene, wrote that people are best able to change their ways when they find two things at once in nature: something to fear, a threat they must avoid, and also something to love, a quality which they can do their best to honor. Either impulse can stay the human hand, but the first stops it just short of being burnt or broken, and the second keeps the hand poised, extended in greeting or in an offer of peace. The gesture is the beginning of collaboration among people, but beyond us in the building of our next home. So I'd like to welcome LaMont Hamilton and John Grade in the building of our next home. LaMont Hamilton is a multidisciplinary artist. His work deals with the spiritual, the ecological, and the subconscious through sound, installation, performance, poetry, and lens-based mediums. He lives and works in Alaska, happy to say. And he's currently an artist and curator in residence at the Anchorage Museum. And John Grade joins us from Seattle, Washington. He is inspired by changing geological and biological forms and systems in the natural world. John works with his studio team to create large-scale, site-specific, immersive sculptural installations. He's interested in impermanence and chance, which are central to his work, along with kinetics and the relationships between the natural world and architecture. Welcome, John and LaMont.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Robert McFarlane, the writer, proposed in his book Underland that we seek to shelter what is precious, yield what has value, and dispose of what is harmful. I'm hoping that we could start by each of you talking a little bit about what it means to you to be connected to the land now, with climate change, a pandemic, atmospheric rivers, frost quakes, bomb cyclones, flash droughts, firenadoes, and why you think it's important for all of us to listen to and experience it. Maybe LaMont, we could start with you.
I was going to say start with John, but I'll try to answer that. I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question?
I think maybe just an introduction to you and your work and your connections to land, and why you think it's important to us today to find those connections to the natural world.
Okay, for me, introduction to me, and I guess I'll keep it brief because as a multidisciplinary artist, I do a lot of things. But principally right now, I'm working with sound. And in working with sound, I've been doing a lot of field recordings and being out in nature in various ways in order to compile this iterative large body of work called To Hear the Earth Before the End of the World, which is a play off poet Ed Robeson's book, To See the Earth Before the End of the World. My goal principally with this is multifaceted, but I'll try to be brief. My goal was personal initially, and it was kind of a distilling of my own personal travels and being in various locations, whether in Brazil or different places around the world, and being immersed in nature in a way that felt, um, I don't want to say like home because I think that sounds too cheesy, but it felt beyond something I had known previously. And that beyond is, there's a lot to unpack with that. So I'll just leave it at that. So that this work kind of has been building over several years, and it's now, in its third iteration, I guess. And it's still building, it's still becoming something. And the idea principally why working with sound and thinking about nature is because I am a lens-based artist as well, and so I understand and very comfortable with video and photography and these sort of things, and I appreciate the multiple ways in which those have been the nature has been depicted with those mediums. But for me, there was something missing, something that the poetics of it was not full or complete in those mediums to me. And even with poetry, it seems like there was something that was incomplete. It was coming from a very specific vantage point. Same with, photography or video. So with me, I was more interested in sound because sound is a phenomenon that has no vantage point, truly. Things Sound originates from things, but once it originates from things and moves within the environment of multiple sounds, it becomes nebulous in various ways, and it allows the imagination to open up in tremendous ways. And matter of fact, that was the most impressive thing about me, specifically being in Brazil. I was in the island of Itaparica, which is off near Salvador, Bahia, but it's off the coast, and it's surrounded by. I mean, it's inhabited, but where I was staying was largely uninhabited. It was just the sounds of everything that impressed me the most, literally impressed upon me. And I carried that, and I continue to carry that. And I think since then, but maybe even leading up to then, it was already kind of set up. My ears have been kind of opened and groomed to kind of hear the nuances of things. So what I'm interested in with this particular piece is not that one-to-one relationship, recording a bird or recording these nature sounds and saying, hey, here's this nature sounds and this is from this location. There's people who do that, and I admire those people. I'm more interested in what happens with sound when it does become nebulous. What happens to sound when it becomes part of the imagination and memory and all these other things. So in doing that, I hypermodulate the sounds, and I try to create these kind of soundscapes that allows one to kind of fall into more or less a dream stance, dream trance or type of thing. I'm not going to go too much further because I can go on and on and on. So I want to leave room for John to be able to answer this question as well.
Thanks, LaMont. John, you've been working in the natural world for decades. Does it feel more acute in this moment?
It does. I mean, between the pandemic and how politically divided and divisive so much of the discourse has become, and the way that the world's ecosystems are changing so rapidly, I think one of the main things for me within that thinking has to do with, I really kind of landscape, especially landscapes that we consider the natural world, unpopulated landscapes, people. It's a solitary endeavor. And kind of coming a little bit back to your Robert McFarland quote, I think he does some interesting thinking about the idea of going out somewhere for solace and for refuge. And I think there's a bit of a trap there where we idealize or romanticize wilderness, that we set aside and we can go and renew ourselves there. And I think especially things like the forest fires that are happening on the West Coast and Alaska, they really bring home the fact that not only are our actions contributing to these enormous fires, but that they're not then places that we can go and live out a fantasy that we've carved out some part of the world that's still set aside for us. So I think a lot of the thinking I've been doing has to do with the social component of my work, because I am making objects, these large objects generally, and I have a team of 15 people that help me do that. And then I'm very interested in a collaborative approach where I bring members of what we could call an audience, and hopefully we break down that idea of an audience and make them participants in what they're seeing. So there's already all that social part of what I'm doing with the work. But I think one of the significant steps for me in the past couple of years has been to bring other people with me into these environments. I mean, from one end of the range is simply my dog, or my wife, who's always been with me in a lot of this, but then my team itself. So that might even be as simple as we're going into here locally in Seattle, we're doing a piece at the Arboretum, the University of Washington's Arboretum. So bringing my whole team to go through the gardens and talk through why we choose a site. So this isn't just me choosing a site, it's the whole group. And, of course I have this editorial control. But so I think to sort of round that out, it's about thinking about all of the people that are involved in making these things happen. And I think that we need to widen that to thinking about museums and their roles. And it's been a really difficult couple of years for museums, literally being closed. And how do we think about the mission of a museum more broadly and maybe more inclusively? And for me, I'm really excited about making things out in the natural world and perhaps bringing them into the museum, but maybe more interestingly, they come into the museum before they're gone, before they go out and are affected in the path of wildfire, for instance, or they come back to the museum after they've had that, so that it leaves room for people to anticipate what's going to happen, to project results, and maybe fill in a kind of an origin story for what they're seeing within the institution.
Thanks, John. I hope we have a chance to talk
Again,
about
I think
the project in Alaska. Sorry, I didn't mean to go ahead. And
Sorry,
finish.
what's that, Julia?
Oh, I was just hoping we would have a chance later to talk about the project in Alaska in the forests and with the fire. So yeah.
Let's do that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. LaMont, if we could go back to you for a second. You briefly mentioned in your last comments about working with Ed Robeson and also being inspired by his poem "To Hear the Earth Before the End of the World." Can you talk a little bit about your collaboration with Ed and maybe your voyage in Alaska last summer?
Yeah. Well, his book is To See the Earth Before the End of the World. And I've kind of, my play on it is To Hear the Earth Before the End of the World. And yeah, Ed's a dear friend. We've known each other since I lived in Chicago. I think we've known each other now for nearly, I think it's been over 10 years now, actually, maybe around 12 years. And Ed has always inspired me with his book. Actually, I used to carry To Hear the See the Earth Before the End of the World everywhere I went. All my travels, I had it in my bag. And I always, he and the poet Jay Wright were two kind of pillars where I needed grounding, or kind of ways in which to process and understand things. I mean, they have been very instrumental in that way. And I think it's outside of what I'm working on now. I mean, the project that Ed and I are working on currently, I guess there's some parallels, but for the most part, principally, it's a little separate. But we're working on a project that's untitled as of now, but about the Black soldiers who built the Alaskan Highway. They were part of a large, 6 regiments. There was 3 of 6 regiments, but if my facts are correct, the Alaska Trail of the Highway was their doing. So what we're interested in is, once again, going into this kind of idea of poetics. We're interested. There's a lot of really beautiful research out there that has been done in books and specials about this feat, but we are interested in bringing out the poetics of it. There was a lot of men who were up here at that particular time of the three regiments. I think there was a surplus of 4,000 men. And we know a few names, but we don't know every name, and we don't know how many died. We don't know much about the overall experience other than kind of bullet point things that we all can kind of relate to, such as working in negative 70-degree weather and things like that. Not relate to, but feel viscerally when we hear these type of things. But we are interested in delving more into their psyche, as they were here. And we have to do it imaginatively, because obviously I don't think any of them are still around. So we can't, and if they are, I mean, I'm sure their memory is not where we can, would want to poke and prod. So we're trying to take our own kind of poetic license and build from that. So we went on that journey. We drove the Alcan over the summer and took notes, and in an RV, we were sleeping out there, and just really trying to bring in to our own spirits, not only the spirit of them, but also the spirit of that tremendous and almost journey and feat of Greek mythology, if you think about it that way. I mean, the whole highway is 1,600 plus miles, and I think they did a 800 some odd mile stretch in Alaskan wilderness, like virgin Alaskan wilderness, with meager supplies, really. And it and these were men who were flown over really from all over the South and kind of the Midwest, and some places on the East Coast. So this was completely foreign terrain for them. And I can get in much further for that into that thing, but right now I'm not going to get too long-winded about it. But that's kind of what we're doing. And but Ed also, in this sound piece that I've been working on, I send him tracks all the time, and I not to get his stamp of approval, but I want him to understand what I'm doing, not with his poetry. I want to make it clear that I'm not taking his poetry and making sound out of it. I'm just using the title, but in using the title, I like to hear his feelings on what I'm doing. And if using that title, to hear the earth before the end of the world, which is a play on to see the earth before the end of the world, that the ingredients are still there, because in that title, his title, and my kind of iteration of his title, there's a doubling happening. There's this idea of the earth, and then the idea of the world, to hear the earth before the end of the world. And it also presupposes that one will be around the earth after the world is gone. And I think that's when we think about climate change and, Anthropocene and ecological turn and things like that. These are epochs that this earth has gone through many a times. And even humanity probably, not probably, humanity has gone through these type of changes and survived. But if this world does survive what this change actually is, the earth itself is going to be just fine, and it's going to, morph into something different than it already is. If need be, it will adjust. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind, kind of what John was saying earlier, that, when we idealize, this nature, and idealize this whole Anthropocene and all this stuff, when we idealize it in a way that kind of becomes news talking points, we miss the fundamental thing about and fundamental lessons about what this actual planet we live on is and goes through. And I think that there's many lessons to be learned there, beyond kind of the initial quote you said about love and fear. There's the spectrum is far broader than that. And if we keep it to that kind of literally anthropic way of thinking, then we're missing, a lot of different opportunities to grow and learn more about this earth as a population in whole. I think there's many people and many cultures who know and live on this earth in a way that's reciprocal. But I think as a population as a whole, we're missing a lot of we're missing the point in a lot of ways.
And being able to spend time with each of you and getting to know your work a little bit more, I've been struck repeatedly by how both of you spend time with the land. John, whether it's climbing or trekking, or LaMont with your sound recordings, looking at the microscopic. I've heard you express a consciousness about what you're imposing on the landscape and how you're experiencing versus what you're learning from it. Taking it in without taking away, and perhaps maybe that's the way to describe that consciousness. I'm also struck by your shared interest in decay, looking at what's been left behind by the land and how we might experience that. John, leaving things in the environment and in the path of forest fires, or in the water, or to be left to be eaten by termites. So John, you mentioned museums. I think museums are evolving too as part of these conversations, but also in thinking and rethinking about what gets preserved and collected, not just by museums, but maybe by humankind. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with the idea of what you save as an artist, what you think museums should save? How do you preserve that experience? What's important to preserve? As a museum, we're talking about how do we collect sound? What does that look like as a museum? Maybe just a little bit from each of you about that idea of ephemeral versus permanence, and perhaps the museum's role in that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that one on. I at some points become more invested in the process of how something is made, certainly than at arriving in an idealized state that we want to preserve. So that's part of this idea of embracing change. I think within this idea of how we then show that sort of thing in a museum, we touched on that a little bit. But maybe to go into the direction of the sound, I an excitement in getting to know Lamont's work, from afar. I really like a lot of what's happening there with the sound element, and in particular, just the subtlety of what's going on in that exploration. I feel there's a sort of a kindred thing there for me, because I find that when I'm part of the drive for me going out into these more remote landscapes is to move away from places where you're going to hear an airplane overhead, or where there's going to be a trail, sort of vestige of humanity, and instead start to become more engaged with the wind, with the weather, with animals, insects. And I had a recent experience. I'm doing a large commission for Microsoft's got a new campus. And as part of what I've been doing with Microsoft, I was able to go into a silent chamber that they've developed for research. And when you're in this chamber, there's a set of bafflings, so you don't have sound waves that are moving around. So it's so silent, especially if you're in there by yourself without any kind of light. You start to become aware of your body as a landscape, so that you hear your blood pumping, you hear just the subtlest shift in your neck, and it's just these loud, bone movements. And the simple thing of like breathing becomes momentous. So I think what that did for me was sort of put myself in a box and think about my body related to the landscape as well. And then that helps inform how I look at the landscape when I'm out there. Maybe if we could queue up, I could share a brief snippet of video about Reservoir, which is a piece that was inspired by sound, and a very subtle sound. So this is at a sculpture park in Articella, Trento in Italy. And I was tasked with creating something in this grove of trees. And when I was in this grove of trees, I became aware of this, which I took to be insects, but was actually the light patter of water hitting the forest floor, just very, very gently. So I wanted to create a sculpture, which we're seeing here with the video, that was in direct response to the rain. So this is a sculpture with several thousand small cast elements that each collect rainwater. And the shape of each is derived from a simple gesture of putting your hands together to receive water. And the scale of each of them is derived from the different size hands of the people who worked on the project. So fortunately, we had a very large person all the way down to a very small person, so we had a nice range. And in the video there, you were actually seeing two iterations of the sculpture. And functionally, the sculpture is supported by this grove of trees in each case, and that's tethered by springs, so that as the rainwater collects in these vessels, the sculpture goes from weighing about 80 pounds to then with water almost 1,000 pounds. And it sinks down much closer to the viewer. In the second iteration we saw, that's actually currently installed at a place called LaMont in Loire Valley in central France. And if you visit it there, in the background beyond the grove of trees, you see this 1,100-year-old castle and these very clear. So one of the things that's built into that sculpture is that it can vacillate between the collection of water, which turns all of those forms into a very abstracted shape. And then as that precipitation dries away and the piece comes back into a different position, you see the shape of the turret echoed in the sculpture. So I think for me, sound in a project like that becomes really important, both as inspiration, but then also when you're experiencing that and you're standing near it, you hear this really subtle clinking between the different elements and the shedding of waters too. So it kind of comes from both ends of it. And maybe the final thing I'd say about that as it relates to museums is how to take a project like this into an architectural context. And it was part of a recent exhibit at the Seattle Art Museum, which focused on the role of water in the landscape. And so, a fairly traditional approach is to take a video and some text related to this, but I also think there's a way of creating a secondary iteration of the piece that's in the space of the museum, responding to its architecture, so that people can then project what that would feel like out in that landscape that might be very far from the institution.
It's beautiful work, John. I hope to experience it one time in person. I mean, it seems amazing, especially I can just imagine the sound when it does rain, being captured in those cupped hands, so to speak. I have I guess the question about sound and the ephemerality of sound and sound in the museum. Julie, am I getting that right? Sorry, it's early in the morning.
It's about, museums as this idea of preserving the past or an object, and maybe an evolution to understanding that audience are different, experiences can be different, supportive artists may look different in the future, and that what we preserve or what we hold and keep may keep evolving. Sound being one example.
And I think so. There's two things. Like when we think about the archive, sound is an event that is hardly ever captured in the archive. I mean, yes, there might be some video that has sound, or some museums might have collected field recordings, sans video or things like that. So I think it becomes a very interesting and difficult, but also important thing to consider, and it's beyond my kind of expertise, that consideration. But I will say that for me, there's a lot of sounds that are literally going extinct. We won't hear them again, and that's natural and man-made sound, human-made sounds. I mean, there are sounds, for instance, from the Industrial Revolution or whatever, that is just not sounds that we hear anymore. There's like a snow plow train that's down the water. I'm pointing, you can't see what I'm seeing, but there's a trail, a railroad track down the way, and there's a relic It's just sitting there. It's like in a museum type thing for you to see in it. You know, it's a snowplow, so it was meant to break ice and things like that. But we'll never hear it. You know, at least not here. I'm sure it's still operating, something like that, still operating here in Alaska, somewhere in the north or something like that. But I would probably never hear that, you know, and there's other things that, you know, one can think of that, you know, we will probably never hear again. But also it speaks to the idea of what sound is. And I guess let me take a step back and not try to ramble too much, but just stating how we overlook the importance of sound. Or not say we, but I think institutionally sound is overlooked, mainly because it's ephemeral nature, but also I think it's just hard to objectify. It's hard to kind of make an object, you know, rather than like a record or something like that, something that, you know, a tape or something that physically can be there and be played, and then you can be transported. Sound itself in the natural world is a phenomenon. It happens and it's gone, and there's no coming, there's no rewinding it. So how do you capture that? How do you preserve that? How do you present that in a space that's, you know, a museum type space? Like I said, those are questions that are beyond me, but I like to think that it should be something that museums should be thinking about, because every other kind of institutions, I think, are thinking about. Science is thinking about it, you know, physics is thinking about it, you know, you think about medical is thinking about it, you know, the phonons and kind of things. I mean, I was reading the other day that there's a thing called phonomics that is trying to come out. Like they're thinking about ways in which you can take, like for instance, electronics is based on electrons, and the movements, and phonomics is based on phonons, and using that kind of using oscillations and the waves to create, you know, certain type of new technologies. So I think that, you know, and the spiritual is thinking about it, you know, mythology speaks about sound, whether we talk about, you know, ancient myths from around the world that were creation myths. Most creation myths have sound in it in some way, shape, or form. So my point is, which is a rambled point, is that it feels like museums are either willingly not wanting to explore it for whatever reasons, or ignorant to the fact of its importance. And either way would be, you know, kind of, either way is really, you know, well, let's leave it at that. Either that's probably what's happening. But, and I think that also there's not many people with the expertise on how to distill all these facets of sound into something presentable or archivable. And I think that's an expertise that universities are going to have to start to, you know, grooming, and then institutions like museums can have people in place who do have that type of expertise on how to make that distillation happen. And it can't be, you know, reliant on the artist, because sound has different movements just like any other art. So one is going to think one is more important than the other. You know, right now when we think about sound in institutional spaces, it's kind of the quote unquote free jazz movement, or there's like, you know, music concrete, or, you know, these sort of things that all are movements, but are indicative of sound in itself, but they're not fully encompassing of sound. And I think it can turn some people off if, you know, you go in and this is what is being presented as sound alone. So much else is left out.
Thanks a lot. I'm hoping when we come back to you, you might talk about your exhibition coming up at the Anchorage Museum and what was in Colorado, and your what you've been organizing for the planetarium and other spaces here. John, I was struck by what you said earlier about audiences becoming participants, reframing that word. We too have been interested in moving away from that idea of the word audience, and somehow these passive transactional people that come through museum doors. Also, I think for a long time we've been interested in how do you support an artist's work in the natural world in a way that doesn't imply the outcome or suggest that it has to come back to the museum architecture in some way. Can you talk a little bit? One of my favorite stories about working with artists is actually about you encountering muskox in the Arctic. Can you talk a little bit about, you have a lot of work where perhaps people don't see it in most of its stages and may experience the final object in a way that's been altered by the landscape. Can you, I think you have a video of that includes the pingo. Maybe we could see that too.
Yeah, so I've got two videos that we could share. Maybe I would just on this subject start with Middle Fork, if that's all right. Just in terms of really capturing the participatory piece of it. I think of, it's just a small, oh, here we go. So this is a project where a very simple gesture, which was to capture and cast a tree. And this could have been done in about 2 hours digitally, but instead it was really important to me that we have this visceral experience with a group of people over a couple of weeks responding to the elements of the tree, and then taking these casts of the tree into a space where we invited people who just simply happened to be passing by to participate by helping us to actually build the skin of the sculpture onto these casts. So they have this maybe 3 or 4 hour experience of very directly engaging with the specificity of a little footprint of the surface of that tree. And this went on, the process of building this sculpture, for almost 2 years. And here we're seeing it in its most current iteration, where it's about 105 feet long at the Seattle Art Museum. But it was also shown earlier when it was only about 50 feet long at the Smithsonian at the Renwick in DC, and also went to the Davos World Economic Forum in Switzerland. I think for me, there are a couple things here where we're bridging this idea of a response to something out in the natural world with the idea of bringing it into institutions where people can directly participate with the point of inspiration. I think there's a lot of ownership when you have people that are participating in making something, and that ownership extends beyond the relationship with the sculpture. I mean, for me, it's really rewarding because I'll come into this atrium and I often overhear somebody talking about how they worked on the sculpture. But beyond that gratification, I think there's a sense of ownership with the museum itself, that you've been part of something that's happened in there, instead of this idea of romanticizing the solitary genius, or that people who are making art that ends up in a museum are in some sort of elevated capacity or status, and it just sort of equalizes access and the thinking about the institution. The arc of the Middle Fork project for me that's important is that this sculpture moves from institution to institution, and each time it moves, it the space that it's going in. And at a certain point, we're going to run out of spaces that are large enough to hold the piece, or we'll run out of interest, either way. But at that point, the idea is to take the sculpture and lay it at the base of the tree that it was cast from and let it disintegrate into the ground. And to watch that process and learn interesting things from that process. And it's a kind of a strange way, but I think it's an authentic way of honoring all of the effort of thousands of people that participated by, instead of monetizing that effort and selling it, you let it return into the earth and see it as something that's about change, that's about not trying to capture an ideal moment.
You want to talk about Pingo at all?
Yeah, let's do that. Maybe we just segue straight into that. Yeah, so we have a third video about a project called Murmur, which is a really important project for me. And it came from my relationship with the Anchorage Museum and being invited initially to come out and sort of follow my nose in terms of what interests me. And I have such an interest in trees. So my first point of departure was to see how far above what we consider the tree line I might find a tree of a large enough scale. My criteria was that the tree is large enough that a bear could use it it as a scratching post. So an old hunter sort of fed me a direction to go, and my wife and I were dropped into the Noatak at Gates of the Arctic and spent a couple weeks paddling down the Noatak to find this tributary where there was this tree. And sure enough, there was a bear laying at the base of the tree. So I had to back off and wait a little while, but was able to get to this tree. So with this video footage, as a byproduct of going to see that tree, I discovered these amazing objects called pingos. And in the Arctic, which we're seeing here in the summer, we have these very flat plateaus of very difficult to navigate terrain. And then you have these rises that we're seeing right here. And this is an Arctic pingo. And underneath just about a foot of soil, you have an enormous ice lens. And this ice lens, the one that we're seeing right there, it might be 400 or 500 years old. So I also had this wonderful moment. We're seeing now a murmuration of birds happen directly behind one of these pingos. And it was such a gift, such a kind of a connection between the time scale of a pingo taking hundreds of years to create with this murmuration of birds. So combining these two inspirations became this sculpture that we're seeing a couple of images of here. A large-scale kinetic sculpture with the idea that people enter inside it, and its kinetics that are opening and closing these fingers such that it collapses in over people while they're standing inside. This is all carved, salvaged Alaskan yellow cedar. And so when you're standing inside, you have this sense of what ultimately happens with a pingo, which is that it will collapse in on itself. So this desire to bring people in and experience that within the museum. And so often people are, well, I've never heard of a pingo. So it's kind of wonderful to bring this more esoteric landform into the museum. And the kinetic nature, which we're not seeing in that footage, as it's opening and closing, all of those perforations are sending shadows racing across the floor at a much faster pace than the sculpture's moving. And that's sort of echoing this bird life, the murmurations that inspired the sculpture. And the final element to that I'll touch on, it's a very complicated project, but that we worked with another artist, Riley Donovan, who created an augmented reality experience so that visitors to the museum were able to put on headsets and see holographic content directly related to the landscape that inspired it. And because computing power is still in its infancy, we had to be very economical about what we showed. And there's a beautiful stereoscopic component to this where you would hear the birds moving around you in space. And, kind of going back to LaMont's real interest in the idea that sound is not this recording, but it's much more of, it's around us, it's a real thing, it's alive. And if I could just, I've responded quite a bit to Lamont's work, and there's a piece in particular, it's called Disappearing into the Arms of Secret Dreams. And it's on Lamont's website, so hopefully people could see it there. But one of the things I really responded to in that work was there's this shift, this play of the focal range where it's to do with trees, so I'm a good audience member for the content there. But also what I really love about it is that I'm not sure if I'm moving between one tree in the background and another in the foreground, or if I'm actually inside the branches of a tree. And I think what that piece does, and the reason I bring it up, because I think it relates to the Murmur project, is that there's a real embrace of ambiguity, and there's an embrace of change. And this is, I think, terrain that's so fertile for people going to a museum, where you're not so much looking to sort of understand something appropriately. You're really looking at, how does this thing impact my life in a meaningful way?
Yeah,
Thanks.
and thank you,
LaMont, go
John.
ahead and feel free to
And
respond.
yeah, thank you for echoing my piece, and then also for it. Two things. Um, One is, I think, our shared interest in permanence. I think initially, eventually, that's where your work is. You mentioned the cast of the tree disintegrating, or literally integrating into the environment. And so that sense of impermanence. And I think that's kind of something I lean into fully, and it's always kind of been there, which kind of belies my start as a photographer. I think even as a photographer, I was interested in foreground, not background. Most people, and what I mean by that is, like, I used to teach photography, and the first question most students ask is, how do I blur the background? I want to make that, that bouquet. But to me, it's always been more interesting what's in the foreground. And I think that speaks to a certain level of impermanence, in this kind of roundabout way. And I say that because the things that are in our foreground, the things that are most immediate, are usually the things that we don't fully grasp. We're always looking or projecting into what's in the distance instead of what's right here. And I think foregrounding sound in that way, tries to put one present, like you were kind of saying. And that presence is very important, but it also speaks to an impermanence of presence. And I think that is what I most want to impress upon the visitors of particularly the sound installation. To kind of speak a little bit about it, is it when you walk into the space, it's kind of, there's nothing there but the sound and light, color that's slightly undulating into different colors, but mostly it's sound. And what's important to me is that the sound is there before you get there, and it's there when you leave. It's going to be there regardless of whether a visitor is in there or not. And I love that idea, and the kind of parallel to how things are literally in the world. If I open this door, a rush of sound is going to come in. I close the door, it's almost like the wind isn't really actually blowing, even though it is. The birds aren't actually here, even though they are. And I think that type of foregrounding, saying that if we open our ears, and I want to kind of detour when I say open our ears, because our ears are, and our sense of hearing, is literally, kind of, in my estimation, is spiritual, because we can perceive 20 to 20,000 hertz normally, and that's a broad spectrum. And you think about 20,000 hertz. I mean, that's 20,000 oscillations per second that our ears can perceive. And in that case, it doesn't feel like sound, it feels more like sensation. And also thinking about sound as not just things that we hear, but sensation, because sound themselves are pressure waves, they're sensations. And that sensation, excites our ears, but also excites our bodies. And one can also surmise excites our, imagination, our internal, our spirits, or all that stuff. So foregrounding this is, I don't like to call it ephemera, because though it is fleeting and though it is impermanent, it is always still there, and it has been there since literally the beginning of the universe. Sound has been there. There's this thing called baryon acoustic oscillations, which is pretty much the fossil remnants of sound waves that galaxies are born in. So it's there. And now how do we foreground it in a way? So with my work, I like to foreground it in one's imagination. I don't want to be there. I don't want to be, like you said, the kind of visionary artist whose work you're going to experience. I want you to go in and be transported into your own inner space. And the sound is just a mechanism for that to happen. So really, as in the show in Colorado at the University of Colorado's Art Museum, which is going to be also at Anchorage Museum, and also the live performance that was in San Francisco at Gray Area, the whole idea is for the visitor to be, in a sense, excited, for the sound to excite the imagination in the visitor. And I don't need to know what that exaltation is. I don't need to know what came about from it. To me, all that's important is that it could happen, or it did happen. Just like, the sound that's out here in the environment, yeah, I don't want to ramble too much. I know we're running out of time, but yeah.
Well, maybe last question for each of you. I think as arts professionals, museum professionals, all of us are thinking about our own carbon footprint. For museums, it's thinking about our impact if we're traveling large crates and things across the world, and ourselves. I think we're all conscious of our imprint on the planet and at different levels. I think your work in sound and your human body being the work and your experiences, and sending things back into the environment speaks to this. Putting you both in the role of futurists, what do you imagine for your future, for our future? Any final words for the planet?
I could jump on that. I think it's important that, of course, that we think about how to minimize our carbon imprint. That we just did a project where we sent it to a new U.S. embassy in Guatemala. And so we were able to make those crates such that they were designed so that they could be reconfigured to take on another task for river restoration outside of Guatemala City. You can do things very tangibly like that. I run my house and studio completely on solar panels. But again, that's a sort of a privileged position of a certain point in a career where I can eke out enough money to have those solar panels. But I think in the face of trying to do everything we can, and I think we're going to get better at that. I think we're going to find technologies that are going to, change how we fly things across the world, hopefully. But as we are in this messy state of transition, I think it's important to remember that art matters enough that we need to prioritize its being seen and understood. I was faced with a real moral quandary with the large tree sculpture Middle Fork that I showed the video there with, because we put that on a jet and sent that to Switzerland, and that's an enormous carbon suck, just this gesture. But ultimately, I was convinced that by having that in front of an audience, this World Economic Forum, these are world leaders, corporate, Fortune 500 leaders, to have the direct participation of people with that degree of power, I think it was a meaningful enough thing to have these people experience and to put a wider perspective on things for them, and for them to participate in the piece, that it was worth that move in terms of the fossil fuels. And maybe not everyone would agree with me there, but I think it's important that we're open-minded in our thinking, especially when it comes to making objects. The last thing I would say on that is that sometimes it may make sense to use, like we've seen an early piece here where there are probably 10 pounds of polymer, so why put plastics out into the world when I could be doing other projects where I'm using salvaged wood? But there's sort of an irony in that there's so little waste, especially if you're able to buy industrial seconds and you're using this thing conscientiously, what we kind of consider to be an evil medium than others. And that's evolving into biodegradable polymers that we're using now as well. So again, that comes back to looking into the future and having this shared mission of finding ways to make things and move things more sustainably.
And for me, I think that, I've dissolved my work more and more. I think the sound work is the latest iteration of that dissolution. And even before I would make, these are things that no one would ever see. I'm always making things and I place them in nature. These are kind of more rituals for me than anything. So in those things, I place them there so that they can then, be morphed by the land and change into something else. Usually they're, for instance, one was a metal box that I created and I left all these writings, these kind of poems that I wrote, and put them in the box, and just set the box onto the surface, and wanting it to be collected and erode over time and things like that. And Actually, when I went back to try to find it, this was in Maine, and I couldn't find it. So it was I didn't want to dig to find it, and so it had been buried already. This was a couple years after I put it there, but I'm very much interested in how things can be dissolved. My work can dissolve as much as possible, and that's a challenge. And also, to kind of a parting note, is this idea of sustainability that really bothers me, because I think that we have to understand or think about if we are using the word sustainability as a stand-in for threshold, or if we're using sustainability as what it actually is. And what I mean by that is, usually I feel like a lot of times, we talk about sustainability as a threshold of how much we can consume, extract, blah, 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 until we, you know, um, go past the event horizon, and we, at that point in no return, now we done messed up, um and if we stop thinking, and I think when I hear, especially from from a organizational standpoint, from a corporate standpoint, it seems like it's talking about a threshold. um how far can we go before we mess up and we can't go back? And if we continue to think about sustainability that way, well, eventually we're going to cross that threshold without even knowing it. Um, so if we kind of rewind, I think going back to more of a, when I say an indigeneity way of thinking about our place on this earth, and that's not any specific indigenous culture, but that idea of indigeneity, um, being back with the land and having a reciprocal relationship with the land, is the only way I think that true sustainability can happen. But once again, I think we need to draw a distinction between the use of that word, whether we're talking about true indigeneity way of life, or if we're talking about a threshold, or is it something in between? I think in our modern world, we're striving for something in between, and that something in between is not anything I imagine right now, but um, I guess that's where we are.
Well, I just want to thank LaMont. Thank you for being here, sharing your work. And John, thank you for joining us also and sharing your experiences, leading us forward in these conversations. Thanks to the Luce Foundation for their support of artists and museums. And thank you to the New York Historical Society for hosting the program today. And thanks to everyone who was listening.